What's up everybody, it's Charles. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace a strut on your car. On each of the four corners of your car, you'll have various suspension components. And while there's an infinite number of suspension designs, when it comes to our shock absorber assembly, there's really two main types. There's a strut assembly like we're looking at here, and then there is a shock setup. A strut assembly like this one has the coil spring surrounding the shock absorber, and it also supports the weight of the vehicle. On a car that uses a shock, the spring and the shock absorber are two separate pieces. And while it's not recommended, you could technically run that setup without a shock absorber altogether. This one, however, is an integral part of the vehicle's suspension and actually supports the weight of the car. The strut also has numerous components to it, which we'll be going over when we get this out and taken apart. This setup today, we're replacing more for performance, but how do we know if our car has a bad shock absorber? Number one is the vehicle bounces. When we go over a bump or say hit a pothole, it's the coil spring that's responsible for damping the transfer of energy. The shock absorber is what helps control that movement of the spring so you don't see the car bouncing up and down the road. When the shock absorbers fail, they can't control that movement of the spring anymore. Next, you might get the front of the vehicle dive under braking or the rear of the vehicle squat under heavy acceleration. Some of both of those characteristics are normal. However, when our shock absorbers wear out or fail, they don't do as good of a job supporting the weight of the vehicle, especially under those a little bit more extreme conditions. Following right along with the front diving or the rear squatting is excess body roll. The car might have handled like a dream and now it's driving like a boat. So if you're getting excess lean or excess body roll going around a corner, it may be because the shock absorbers are worn out or failed. We may also get excessive noise. Sometimes you can actually hear the fluid swishing around inside of the shock absorber assembly. Now, all these bad things happening with the suspension can also show themselves as very poor tire wear. Most commonly, cupping, because our tire is bouncing up and down quite a bit more than it should. Cupping can often be felt by just running your hand across the tread of the tire, and you'll feel an extreme unevenness. So if you have any of those signs of suspension wear, or say you're modifying your car and putting lowering springs on it, maybe time for new shock absorbers, whether that's a strut style like this or a simple shock style like this. Now, if you want to test the shock absorber on your car, easy way to do that is called the bounce test. What we're going to do is we're going to go to each corner of the vehicle and we're going to bounce it up and down a few times. And we're looking for how much movement that corner of the car has. This one here has a bad shock absorber. So when I bounce the car, it's going to bounce up and down a handful of times. This is the shock absorber failing to control the compression and the rebound of the suspension. Compare that to this car. When I bounce it, it compresses, rebounds, and then settles at the proper ride height. This is how it should perform. If your car's bouncing all over the place like the black one, time to get those shock absorbers replaced. After we've done our initial checks on our suspension, there's a few things we want to do before we start taking parts off the car. We want to make sure we do a good visual inspection so we know exactly what parts to replace. Now, there are sometimes you can get a whole entire strut assembly all ready to go that drops in and out. We're not going that route on this car because we're trying to tune the suspension for street class and autocross. But even on our visual inspection, we can see that this spring isolator is all cracked. Our dust boot is a little crimped up, but we could easily reuse that. We want to make sure that we're inspecting the shock absorber body for any damage, any severe rust. We want to make sure that it's fully seated in the knuckle, which can cause big time suspension geometry problems if it's not. We're looking for any impact damage, say the shock absorber is bent. Really, the most common thing you'll find on a visual inspection is worn out bits of rubber bushing and a shock absorber leaking. There are some components like the bump stop and some bushings that we're not able to put our eyes on. For me, oftentimes that stuff's worth just going ahead and replacing. Before we start loosening any bolts, let's hit it with some rust penetrant. Today we're going to be using WD-40 Specialist Rust Penetrant with the Flexi Straw. You guys know I love the Flexi Straw. In an ideal world, you would do kind of a pre-treat either a day before or a couple hours before to give that rust penetrant some time to soak in. And the more rust you have on the suspension, the more important this step really becomes. As we evaluate our suspension to look and see how we're going to get the strut out, there's a handful of things that I look for. Even though it's generally recommended anytime you do suspension work to get a vehicle alignment, if I can do this job without having to get an alignment right away, I want to try and do that. This means if I can avoid breaking the jam nut loose for the tie rod or taking any bolts out that are eccentric bolts, which are used to adjust the vehicle's alignment. In our case, we're going to have to push the knuckle down in order to fish our strut out of the top and out of the bottom control arm. So what I'm actually looking at is this bolt here on the upper control arm, and I think that's the one that we're going to go ahead and remove. Removing that really long bolt that goes through the upper control arm and disconnecting our sway bar should give us enough room to get that strut out. Let's go ahead and start by taking the lower bolt for the strut assembly out. If you're struggling to get the bolt out, pulling up a little bit on the suspension, maybe with the floor jack, or pushing down on it a little bit might help make that easier. In this case, if I push down a little bit, the bolt comes right out. Next, let's go ahead and take that long bolt that goes through both sides of the upper control arm out. On this one, we want to make sure we're careful of this bracket for the brake line. We don't want the wrench to slip and bust the brake line or bust the bracket or anything like that. That is one heck of a bolt. So now we have our upper control arm loose. See how much movement we got here. Next, let's go up top and unbolt the strut from there. When it comes to loosening the strut from the top side, we need to pay attention to what we're doing here. There are two studs that come through the body of the car and then two nuts that attach to those two studs. There's also this center part here with these two nuts, one of them being a lock nut. These two nuts are what hold the entire strut assembly together. If you loosen these, you are basically releasing all the spring tension of the strut. There are a couple of very specific repairs that I've done that would require you to do that. However, that's not what we're doing. So if you're doing a whole strut and you see this center section, leave it alone until we're out of the car. Only take the nuts or bolts out that are going through the body of the car. Back down on the bottom side, we have our strut assembly almost out. Couple of things you want to be extra careful of for these next steps. If you have to pull up or down or move the suspension around or the wheel hub, we need to pay extra close attention to the brake line. We don't want it under tension. We can also unbolt the sway bar if we need to give us even a little bit more clearance. But we want to make sure that we're not overstressing any of these suspension components, including the bushings, the brake line, ball joints. It looks like where we're at right now, we can lower the strut, we can move the upper control arm, and swing it right out. Taking the sway bar end link off may give you a little bit more movement in the suspension and make it easier to get the strut out. While these can be pretty easy to get out, every once in a while they like to give you a hard time. We'll start by spraying it with our rust penetrant. Next, what we'll do is we'll try and just loosen the nut and see if it'll loosen up. Luckily, that one loosened up pretty easily. On some sway bar end links, there's a hole in the center of the stud that is meant to have a tool put in it. This is a 5mm that'll allow us to counter hold and then loosen the nut. But there are times where this little hole is all stripped out or rusted or just overall unhappy and you can't get a tool in there. Couple of things we can do. We can reach around on the back side. Usually there's a metal ring around the end of the boot. If you can get a pair of locking pliers on there or just a pair of regular pliers at that, you can hold the whole end link and then take the nut off. When you do that though, you need to be extra careful of the boot. We don't want to damage or rip the boot and allow the grease to leak out and dirt or debris to enter our end link. If that doesn't work, sometimes putting a little upward or downward pressure either on the sway bar end link or on the sway bar itself can help put enough tension on it that it'll hold the stud and let you turn the nut. An impact tool often works really well here, and sometimes you can just zip them right off. Worst case scenario, if it comes down to it and you're in a real bad spot, I've definitely had to cut these off before. This is also a really good time to check that lower ball joint and see if it needs to be replaced. There's almost total overlap with getting this bolt right here out. I'm noticing there's a little bit more tension on this brake line than I'd like. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push this whole assembly back and zip tie the control arm to our sway bar. That way this isn't hanging weird and I don't have to worry about it anymore. Now that we are over at the bench, our next step is going to be disassembling this strut assembly, swapping over our new parts, and then putting it back on the car. It's important to note that this assembly is under pretty heavy spring tension. This spring is slightly collapsed and it's all being held together by these two nuts at the end. So what we don't want to do is just zip these two nuts off and have the spring go flying. What we need to do is we need to compress the spring in order to hold it while we disassemble our strut. For that job, we are going to be using our spring compressor. This one's very similar to the factory Volkswagen tool. And of course, I'll put links to everything that we're using today down in the description. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put this in a vise. You don't have to, but it does make it a little easier. The way this style spring compressor works is by rotating this nut at the end, we can drive the spring seat forward or backwards, tensioning or detensioning it. Inside of here, you can see there's a threaded rod that just moves this piece in and out. The spring will sit in this little cup right here, and there's these ridges that prevent the spring from popping up and popping out and hitting you in the face. Let's load our spring up in the assembly. What you don't want to do is put these pads on the outside. That will compress the spring, but it's not the safe way to do it. We want those pads inside the spring itself. There we go. Now, once you get a little tension on it, go ahead and check and make sure that that spring is seated in there all the way. Then what we do is we turn that nut until our spring is compressed. And you'll know that because all this whole assembly is loose. Once we're sure our spring is compressed properly and this strut assembly can be wiggled around so we know that there's no spring tension on it, let's go ahead and remove these two nuts. We have a 17 millimeter nut at the bottom and a 14 at the top. We'll just loosen these. It's important to remember if you're going to be reusing these shock absorbers, don't hit this with an impact. It can spin the shock absorber assembly internally and cause damage to it. This next step is very important to make sure that we stay organized and everything goes back the way that it came from. We're gonna take these parts off one at a time and put them in a way that we'll remember how they go when we put it back together. Now we can take our strut out, we can pull our dust boot off, and inside our dust boot lives a bump stop, which looks like it's been modified. Now that we have our strut disassembled, we can go ahead and take our spring out of our compressor. All right, we have all of our old parts laid out. Let's slide these to the back and get our new stuff laid out. Look at the difference in these two bushings and just how collapsed the other one was. The new one is like twice as thick as the old one. Same thing with the lower bushing as well. So nice that we're replacing these. Our upper spring isolators all tore up. Lower one looked the same way, so we have all those parts ready to go. The shock absorbers that we're using on this car are going to be the Koni Sport, which are actually adjustable, and they come with a handful of different hardware. This is our adjustment knob, and of course our mounting hardware. We'll start with our lower spring seat, then our little plastic cover here. Even though we are putting a performance shock absorber on, everything goes back together the same way it came apart. We'll start with our bump stop. In the future, I might actually do some experimenting with tuning the bump stop, but for now, we're just gonna put the new factory one back on. I got a new boot, so we can install that. Next was our cup. Now, unfortunately, these don't fit with the new shock absorber, so I'm gonna actually have to drill this hole out a little bit. Same's gonna go for the top one. If you're using a factory style or another kind, you might not have to do that, but for these Koni Sports, you do have to drill these two cups out. Let's go ahead and just wipe that out a little bit, make sure there's no extra debris. This piece goes next. Then our lower bushing is gonna go on. For these, I like to take just a little bit of lubricant and get it in there, that way it'll go on a little bit easier. Now, before we put any other parts on, we have to get our spring on. Now, here is our spring that we're going to be installing. This is actually a factory spring because we need to have the factory springs for street class. We got our shock absorber here. We need to put our lower spring isolator on. That just goes just like that. Install our shock absorber. And you'll notice there's a little stop right here. The end of our spring, we need to make sure is seated right in that spot. We need to get our upper spring isolator installed. Then we need our upper plate on. Now we're gonna have to clock this upper plate to the bottom, but we're not gonna do that just yet. We have our upper not collapsed bushing that we're gonna put on. One of the trickiest parts of this whole job is actually getting all of these bushings on so that we can start our nut. A bit of lubricant helps this somewhat. So here's a little trick that might help you get these seated all the way. We have our bump stop on, we have our dust boot on, we have our first metal cup on, and our lower bushing. We'll put our strut cap on. Notice the spring's not on yet. Then what we'll do, we'll leave the top bushing off and put the top plate on. Then we can take our nut, thread it on, and we're just gonna tighten this down, and that's gonna drive our bushing down. You have to be careful here because you don't wanna end up ripping the new bushing. So take your time and definitely don't use a power tool here. Once you got that down far enough where it feels like you'll be able to get all the parts on, go ahead and take all the stuff back off. Now we can go ahead and put it in the spring and we won't struggle as much getting that top nut started. Okay, that part is definitely the hardest part of doing this whole entire job. Now that we have our assembly built, what we need to do is clock our top mount to our bottom mount. The way the top plate sits in the car compared to the lower mounting point is they're basically parallel. So you want to make sure that if this needs to be clocked in a certain orientation, you clock it in a certain orientation. Some of these upper strut plates are directional and have to face a certain way. Ours can face either way. We just need to make sure that these studs are essentially parallel with this mounting point. Once that's done, we can go ahead and take our assembly out of our spring compressor. As we loosen this assembly, we want to make sure that the spring stays seated where it's supposed to be seated. And we'll do this pretty slow just to make sure we get it right. All right, there we go. A little fighting with the top, but our strut is ready to install in the car. Because it's going through the upper control arm, you want to be careful of this painted surface. Maybe worth taping this or putting a rag around the upper control arm so that this doesn't get scratched. Yes, it's cosmetic, but we also want to make sure that these pieces don't rust. Go ahead and cut our zip tie. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the bottom of our strut through the upper control arm. We're going to start the strut up through the strut tower. Then what we need to do is we need to get the bottom of the strut into the lower control arm. This may mean we need to push down a little bit on the lower control arm in order to get it in place. You might need to persuade it just a little bit with a pry bar. Once that's roughly into place, we can take our giant long bolt and get that started. If you are an anti-seize user, this is probably a good spot for a little bit of anti-seize. Start your bolt above the sway bar mount. Slip your washer on. Now in some cars, the holes for these studs or bolts are slotted, and this is used for your camber adjustment. If that's the case, it may not be a bad idea to mark your bolts or really pay attention to the witness marks that are always left behind. That way you can try and get them back where they came from. You might not get it exact, but you'll get it close, and close is good enough to get the car to the alignment shop. Now that we have our strut in the car, got rid of our little paint protection, all of our bolts are started, we need to torque everything down. While you're doing this, this is also a good opportunity. If any of the ball joints do need to be replaced, go ahead and replace them. I went ahead and replaced the lower ball joint. A ball joint tool like this is outstanding, and I wish I would have had one many years ago. But now we need to get our suspension torqued down. But we don't want to torque it down the way the suspension is, which is known as full droop, which basically means the suspension is hung as low as it's gonna go. We want to torque the suspension down at ride height, which means the suspension is pushed up and loaded up the way it would be if the car was sitting fully on the ground. If we put the wheel on, lower the car, we can't access any of this stuff. So we have to simulate the suspension being loaded. There's a number of ways to do it. This is the way that I like to do it. We're gonna start by putting our floor jack on a block or 2 blocks of wood to get it off the wheels. This is gonna prevent our floor jack from sliding out when we put tension on the suspension components. We wanna make sure too that we get the floor jack as centered underneath the control arm as we possibly can. I like to put a block of wood on top of your lift pad on your floor jack. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna slowly bring the floor jack up. Make sure you're paying attention to where it is. We don't want to crush the dust shield for the brakes. slowly bring it up into contact with our lower control arm, and then apply pressure to lift up this corner of the car. We're trying to get this as close to standard ride height as we possibly can. It doesn't have to be exactly to the millimeter. What I usually look for, especially on the front suspension, is for the tie rod assembly to be close to level with the ground. If you can achieve that, you're pretty close, if not exactly on ride height. Now what we can do is we can go ahead and tighten our bolts down. Of course, when it comes to tightening and torquing all these, whether it's suspension loaded or unloaded, and what the torque value is, always be sure you're referring to the repair manual on what you need to do. In our case, we have 95 pound-feet of torque for this upper bolt, the big boy, and we have 75 for our lower bolt. Something kind of unique and cool about these shock absorbers that we just installed is they are adjustable, which means we can change them, make them firmer or make them softer. I'm gonna have to play around with that and see what the best setting is. May depend on what we're doing with the car. For now, probably lean more towards the firmer side. So there's our step-by-step strut replacement. I went ahead and did the other 3 corners of the car. It's important to remember you need to do at minimum the whole axle, which means do both rears or do both fronts, depending on what you're doing and why you're doing it. Doing all 4 may be the right solution. After putting our wheels on, properly torquing, and one final visual inspection to make sure we got everything taken care of, it's time to take her on a test drive. This is actually the maiden voyage for the Miata. Just got the tags the other day, so I'm excited to get on the road. With that, I'm gonna wrap it up. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Links to everything we used down in the description today. Big ups to WD-40 for being such an awesome partner over the years on several different projects, including the GTI and the VR6 R32, and now the Miata. With that, I'm out. Have an awesome day, and I'll talk to you again next time.